Dusk fell like a curtain over the plains of Red Hollow, bleeding fire across the sky as the dry wind dragged whispers down the dirt roads. The town was still, save for the shuffle of boots inside the saloon and the quiet creak of porch swings, where worn-out souls rocked the day away. But near the well outside the church, something far more haunting stirred. A child barefoot no more than 7 sat crumpled at the base of the well. Her dress was threadbare, her lips cracked from thirst, and her eyes held no tears, only the hollow stillness of someone who'd already cried everything out. Her hands were cupped upward not to beg for money, but for something more primal. Water, just water. People passed. Some glanced, most didn't. They had their reasons. This was Red Hollow, after all, a town built on gold, but run on silence. Its wealth came not from kindness, but from the mines that had swallowed many, and spared few. The townsfolk had grown used to looking away. A hungry child was not their concern, it was just the cost of surviving the frontier. But then came the sound that broke the pattern. Hooves heavy, deliberate, the kind that carried authority, and, wait, all heads turned not because they cared about the child, but because of who it was. The richest man in 3 territories was passing through, Judge Silas Mercer, a man who wore black gloves and rode a stallion darker than coal. His presence was enough to hush even the loudest gamblers. He didn't come often. When he did, things changed. He ruled from afar, his power rooted in land deeds and blood signatures. Some said he'd once been a preacher before becoming something, harder, something forged by betrayal and wealth. He had no reason to stop, and yet, he did. He pulled the reins as he approached the child, and for a heartbeat, all of Red Hollow held its breath. The child didn't look up. She didn't need to. Something about his silence felt heavier than footsteps. The town watched, waiting for him to flick a coin or offer a sermon or ride on, but instead, he dismounted slowly, his boots landing like thunder on dry ground. That moment would be whispered about for years, because no one knew the child's name. No one cared to go. And yet, the richest man on horseback didn't ask for it either. He reached into his coat, pulled out his personal canteen, silver-plated, engraved with the Mercer crest, and handed it to her. She drank like she hadn't in Daisy. Maybe she hadn't. The people watching from windows and porches turned their eyes away, suddenly uncomfortable. It wasn't mercy that unsettled them, it was the mirror. His action reminded them what they hadn't done. That night, something shifted. The church bell rang without a hand. A storm that hadn't been forecast swept in from the west. And behind the well, where the girl had sat moments before, only the canteen remained, its silver now tarnished as if it had aged 100 years in 1 hour. Some say the girl vanished because she was a spirit. Others say she was taken in by someone richer, kinder. But the truth lay in the ledger that Judge Mercer kept hidden beneath his saddle. A name had been added that night, not for inheritance, but for remembrance. He wrote it down, even though he'd never asked. Lara by the well. By morning, the town had something it hadn't had in years. Shame, and shame can do strange things to a place that's forgotten its soul. But Red Hollow wasn't done sinning yet, and Lara's story was far from over. What happened to the little girl by the well? Why did Judge Mercer, the coldest man in the territory, stop for her? And what curse did Red Hollow invite when they looked away? Subscribe now and stay with us through this tale of guilt, silence, and the price of a single cup of water, because frontier redemption has just begun, and the dust remembers everything. Days passed, and Red Hollow did what it always did, buried its conscience beneath chores, coin, and the comfort of forgetting. But something lingered in the air, the kind of silence that wasn't born of peace but of secrets that refused to stay buried. The canteen Judge Mercer had left behind was taken into the church by old Reverend Wyatt, who claimed it began leaking. In his hands, before he could bless it, he locked it away in a drawer. But every night, the drawer creaked open. No one believed him. Of course, Red Hollow had stopped believing in miracles or hauntings long ago. But everyone felt it. Something had been disturbed. As for Judge Mercer, he didn't return to his ranch in the north right away. He stayed at the Black Hills Inn alone, as always. He paid in gold and never used the same room twice. Every night, he sat in silence, staring at the journal he kept locked under his saddle. He'd made his fortune off the backs of men who had none, minors, debtors, orphans, widows, and he justified it with law and paperwork. But Lara, the girl at the well, had given him no document, no plea, no threat, just need. That need had touched something in him that the years had buried under title deeds and verdicts. That week, he visited the orphan registry in Drybone County. He found no trace of a Lara matching the description. No family, no background, no entry. It was like she had never existed. But the name remained in his ledger, inked not with obligation but with reckoning. On the next page, he began listing names, not of the rich, but the forgotten. Children from mines, mothers from burned-out farms, workers with broken backs. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe he was trying to find Lara through them. Maybe he was trying to fix something. Then came the incident at the Dry Creek crossing. A woman from Red Hollow, Martha Quinn, was found weeping in the dust. Her son had collapsed trying to fetch water 3 miles from their shack. No one had stopped to help her. except one man. A stranger, tall, lean, with a black coat too fine for the frontier and a scar down the side of his neck like a lightning bolt carved into flesh. He said nothing. He just carried the boy, barefoot, for nearly 2 miles to the chapel steps and disappeared. Some said he was a drifter. Others claimed he was Judge Mercer himself in disguise. But Martha was clear on one detail. When the boy awoke, the first thing he asked was whether the girl with the silver smile was okay. No one knew what that meant. But the Reverend's drawer creaked open again that night. This time, the canteen was missing. Red Hollow began to fray. Cattle wandered off from pastures. Wells turned dry, even though rains had come. The mines echoed strange sounds, and some workers refused to go in. Something had been stirred, and Judge Mercer knew it started with the girl. Not because she'd cursed the town, but because the town had cursed itself the moment it looked away. That evening, as thunder rolled in from the west, Judge Mercer mounted his horse again. He wore his gloves, but he didn't carry a gun. Just the ledger and inside it, a folded map of places he'd once crushed under paperwork and property. The wind howled as he rode toward the horizon, where the dust no longer settled and the sun no longer rose without watching. The next town Judge Mercer rode into wasn't even a town, it was a ghost of one. Hollow Pines, it had once been called. Now, it was nothing more than cracked boards, leaning crosses, and a cemetery where the wind wrote the only stories. He dismounted with care, glancing at the sky like he expected judgment to fall from it. The moment his boots touched the dirt, the wind stopped. Total stillness. Even the crows that had circled the bell tower disappeared. He stood alone. And yet, he wasn't. There were footprints, faint ones, leading away from the well at the center of the ruin. Small ones, child-sized. They hadn't been there the last time he'd come through years ago, when he'd signed the foreclosure that starved the town of water rights. He had told himself back then it was just business. But now, standing before that same dry well, he couldn't ignore the weight pressing on his chest. The ledger trembled in his hands as he turned to the latest name, Josie M. Aged 6. Dehydration, 1876. The same year he signed the rights away. He dropped to his knees and opened the canteen, somehow now in his saddlebag, again, though he hadn't seen it since the night it vanished. He poured water into the well, but the moment it fell, it hissed into steam. The sound followed. A girl's laugh, not joyful, but hollow, mocking, faint. Then it faded, and Mercer whispered to no one, "I remember." Back in Red Hollow, word had spread that Mercer was riding, and not with contracts or foreclosures but with names. He'd begun returning deeds to widows, lifting taxes off old veterans, and leaving sacks of seed in the schoolhouse at night. But no one saw him. They only saw the aftereffects, and they began to whisper, was the man cursed, redeemed, or something in between? At the edge of a mining camp, a foreman found an envelope sealed in wax, stuck to the front of the payroll wagon. Inside were handwritten instructions to disband the operation, pay all workers their full wages for 3 months, and leave the land to regrow. It was signed SM, but the name underneath was Lara's. No one understood it, not yet, but the message was clear. Something had changed, and the canteen kept moving. One morning, a girl in a mountain village found it beside her sick brother's bed. She hadn't left the cabin in 2 weeks. She poured it into his mouth, and he stirred. For the first time in days. When she tried to return the canteen to the steps of the chapel, it was already gone, as if it knew where it needed to be next. Back in Red Hollow, Reverend Wyatt found a torn page on his altar. It was from Mercer's ledger, a name crossed out, not erased, but stricken like a debt paid. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, the water remembers kindness. What none of them knew, what even Mercer didn't yet fully grasp, was that Lara hadn't vanished that night at the well. She had become something the frontier itself couldn't bury. A spirit, maybe, but not the kind that haunts. The kind that holds you accountable. And she was just getting started. The rains came early. That year, not a soft spring drizzle, but a pounding, restless storm that tore through dry soil like it had been waiting for permission. Crops, long dead from drought, began to rise again, as if something beneath the earth had forgiven it. But in Red Hollow, forgiveness was not so easy to come by. The townsfolks, once hardened by routine indifference, now carried unease like a second skin. The air felt charged. Children whispered about dreams of a girl with silver light in her palms. Elders found unfamiliar coins in their cupboards, coins they swore they never owned. And Judge Mercer had not been seen in weeks. In his absence, the ledger kept moving. Across the frontier, it began to appear in unexpected places. At a dry barn in Devil's Bend, a farmer found it open on a bale of hay. A red ribbon marking the page where his son's name had been written 5 years ago. Day the child fell into a collapsed well Mercer's company had failed to cover. The next morning, the barn doors had been fixed, the roof patched, and seed bags stacked high, stamped only with the initials LM, and a handprint in silver dust dot at Widow Hanson's ranch in Burnt Ridge. A hand-built cradle was found on her porch. No note, no tracks in the mud, just a single line carved into the wood. For the child you lost to thirst. She fell to her knees when she read it. Everyone in Burnt Ridge remembered the day her child died. The well had been locked during a dispute. The child had collapsed while she fetched water from a creek 2 miles away. Each act of restitution made the land hum louder. Meanwhile, Mercer wandered deeper into territories where his papers had once held dominion. But now he carried no contracts, no deeds. Only the ledger and a growing number of entries marked with silver X's, as if crossing off scenes one by one. He no longer slept under roofs but by rivers. Canteens hung on tree branches, watching the stars shift above him. People began to speak of him not as a man, but as a myth, a shadow figure who came when no one else did. And always, there was the girl. Lara. She appeared in dreams, in reflections, in the corners of vision where dusk curled and settled. In Dry Hollow, a blind man claimed he saw her standing beside Mercer at dawn. In White Creek, the mother swore she heard her child laugh with someone invisible and her dried-up well gushed with water minutes later. But not every place welcomed the change. In the town of Greystone, where Mercer's name still sparked fear, a banker named Tillman burned a return deed and spit on the silver coin left in his desk. That night, his entire vault flooded not with water, but with thick, sticky mud that couldn't be cleaned or explained. By morning, every name in his account book had vanished. Judge Mercer arrived 3 days later and left a single coin on Tillman's doorstep. A girl's face was etched into it, not as a saint, not as an angel, but as a reckoner. Back in Red Hollow, the Reverend finally spoke to the townsfolk. He stood at the chapel steps as the bell rang itself once again. He held the returned canteen in his hands and said only one thing: what began with thirst ends with truth. But he was wrong. It was far from ending, because redemption never comes clean. It comes soaked in dust, memory, and the weight of what could have been done sooner, and Lara was not done remembering. They say the earth keeps secrets, but the frontier, it never forgets. And on the day the wind turned against Red Hollow, the town finally learned the difference. A wagon arrived at dawn carrying no one but a rusted box. It stopped in front of the old courthouse, the very place where Judge Mercer had once sentenced fathers to prison over debts they never owed. No one saw who brought it. No horses, no driver. Just the box and a trail of wet soil behind it, though the ground had been bone dry for weeks. Inside the box were dozens of names, handwritten slips, water-stained and torn at the edges. Beside them lay an old photo, a child sitting by a well, face half hidden in shadow, eyes glinting like water under moonlight. The townspeople gathered, uncertain, until Mayor Caldwell stepped forward and read the first name aloud. It was his grandfather's, a man known for sealing wells to drive farmers off their land. The second name was a squeater, who'd taken bribes to falsify reports and deny children education. The third was a sheriff, long buried, but whose badge was still nailed to the bar wall as a tribute to law and order. By midday, the list was fully redanned. Everyone who stood there knew, every name tied back to a single thread. Denied water, denied justice, denied care. And behind every denial, Judge Mercer. But Mercer was no longer who he had once been. By now, he had returned to the borders of the territory, where the dry desert met the river canyons. There, he stood beneath the ruins of an old church where he had once passed judgment on miners who'd begged for more time. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The ledger in his hands was nearly full, but now, the entries were different. The ink was faint, almost as if the names were being erased as fast as they were written. He knelt in the dirt, took off his gloves, and placed the ledger on the stone altar. Then he opened the canteen and poured the last of its contents into the earth. It didn't sink, it spread. Clear water flowed in a perfect ring, then soaked down with a hiss-like breath returning to lungs. A wind swept through the ruin, lifting dust into the air, and with it, the faint sound of laughter. But it wasn't mocking, it was grateful. Back in Red Hollow, the school bell rang for the first time in months. No one had pulled the rope. People began leaving jugs of water by their doors. The banker offered loan forgiveness without condition. The miners' children were given free education, not because they were asked to, but because they feared what might come if they didn't. They feared the dust, because it no longer moved randomly. It circled, it watched, it followed those who ignored need. It brushed against those who'd once looked away. And in every swirl of it, people said they saw her Lara, still barefoot, still thirsty. But now, she wasn't asking for water. She was asking who would be next to ignore her. And in that fear, Red Hollow found something it had forgotten: decency. But what of Mercer? He was seen only once more, riding along the canyon's edge at twilight. A child's handprint glowed faintly on the back of his coat, and the cantonau, empty, hung from his saddle like a badge. Some say he vanished into the cliffs. Others say he rides still, ledger in hand, marking names not for punishment but for remembrance, because what began at the well was never about a sip of water. It was about the moment a man stopped to see someone no one else would. The frontier was quiet now, with peace, but with reverence. Red Hollow no longer roared with boots and shouting, but whispered through its changed streets. The schoolyard fence had been rebuilt by hands that once guarded fortunes. The inn served free bread every morning, and the townsfolk, those who used to look away now, paused for every passing child. Yet, despite the transformation, one question continued to echo across the valley. Passed between lips and saloons, church pews, and lonely porches. Who was the girl at the well? Some believed she was a ghost, others a forgotten orphan reborn in wind and dust, but to a few, to those who had once been cruel but now gave without asking, she was something even more powerful, not of shame alone, but of what it meant to be human in a place that had turned survival into selfishness. Reverend Wyatt opened the chapel doors one morning to find a new altar carved in silence overnight. At its center was the canteen, still, silent, polished like silver and glowing in the light of dawn. Surrounding it were handprints, dozens of them, as if children had gathered in the night to anoint it. On the floor below, a single message had been etched into stone. One drink can change the course of a town. As the message spread, so did the axe. Neighbor helped neighbor. Wells once guarded by barbed wire were now open for all. But the biggest change came when the town gathered to honor the name they'd once refused to ask, Lara. They built a new well right where she had once sat. This time, it was carved not for drawing water, but for reflection. Its surface was glass still, and when one leaned in, they didn't see their own face alone. They saw others, children, strangers, a flicker of a girl in the corner, sometimes smiling, sometimes solemn, but always watching. No one saw Judge Mercer again, but the stories multiplied. In towns too small for maps, people whispered of a rider in a black coat who arrived before disasters, who handed water to children and vanished. His saddle no longer carried gold, only books. And in each one, the first name was always the same. Back in Red Hollow, the children of the next generation never knew the frontier as it had once been. They grew up believing water was meant to be shared, not hoarded. That wealth meant nothing. If it couldn't quench another's thirst, that kindness wasn't weakness, it was warning. Written in dust and remembered in silver. And when those children asked the elders why the canteen was locked behind glass, Reverend Wyatt would smile softly and say, because it already emptied itself into us. In the end, the town was not redeemed by gold, or guns, or even fear. It was redeemed by a single moment. A man who had everything stopped, and a girl who had nothing gave him back his soul. The wind still carries her name. In every dusk when the sun sets low across the canyon, the shadows gather near the well, not to haunt, but to listen, because frontier redemption didn't end when the water was shared. It began.